So I've known Steve since sometime before 2011, when he applied to take the Master Beekeeper exam, and was certified. I don't remember. Did you pass?
I passed. Despite your best attempt, I passed on the first time, Landy.
So that's saying something. I'm not sure what, but it is saying something. Which means that Steve is an EAS certified Master Beekeeper. And presumably that tells us that he does know something about what he's talking about. Although, there have been times when I've really wondered. So, Steve runs quite a few hives. How many hives do you have?
200 something. 200 is pretty much a good amount.
So he runs a couple hundred hives in Pennsylvania, in the Pittsburgh area. He also has a pest control business. So when people start, going nuts with yellow jackets, and everybody's, I don't know about you guys, but I probably get 100 or more calls in August every year. You got about people wanting to come and get rid of their bees. What?
Just give them Steve's number.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'll just give them Steve's number when they call and want us to take away their bees, in quotes. So Steve gave a talk some years back at EAS on using oxalic acid as one of the tools in our arsenal for killing varroa mites. And I thought it would be valuable because the season for effective oxalic acid treatments using vaporization is coming up. Typically sometime around Thanksgiving in this area, in an average year, the bees will be more or less broodless. And that's, really the most effective time for hitting them with this particular treatment. But Steve's done a lot of work on this. When I started doing it, he was, I hate to admit this, the guy that I called and asked for advice about equipment and his methods of doing it. So I'm hoping, all of you will learn something. I've certainly learned a few things from talking to him about this topic. Okay, Steve Repasky.
Are you done talking now, Landy?
I'm done talking. You can talk now, all you want.
Good. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody tonight. Hopefully you guys can hear me, and I am sorry that I can't be there in person. Landy, I always like to spend time visiting Landy, and that's our fun to bust each other's chops and catch up on what's happened in the last year, and for her to tell me that what I'm doing is wrong and all that fun stuff. But this way we can at least mute each other and not really be offended. So, but I am appreciative of the opportunity to speak to you guys tonight. And I think what we're going to do and Landy mentioned I did this talk several years ago when oxalic acid was quote unquote new. And in a way, oxalic acid is still new. And we're going to leave it as new because it's like every other chemical that we use in the beekeeping industry. It's constantly changing. We've just had some recent changes here in the last several months as well that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to pause real quick. Andy and Justin, am I coming across okay? We're doing okay with sound?
Yeah.
Yep.
Perfect.
You hear that?
So let's move forward from here and let's talk about this quote-unquote new tool called oxalic acid and what it is and how we can use it as beekeepers in the industry. We call it a new tool, but in reality, it's been used for several decades. It started in Europe in the early 2000s. We've moved over to Canada in 2010, and it's typical in the United States. It finally got approved in 2015. So we're kind of behind everybody when it comes to this type stuff. So it's been used, it's been tested, it continues to be tested, but in the meantime, what we have found is that it's a very useful tool in our toolbox for controlling mites. So what is oxalic acid? Ultimately, it's a strong organic acid, similar to the formic acids that we're using and some of the other organic treatments that we have for mites. It's not fat soluble, which is nice because it means it's not going to build up in our wax. Um, we're not going to see that residue left behind with some chemicals that you may see. It's a natural component in honey. It's also a natural component in many of your greens, your spinach and beans and chives and rhubarbs and other plants like that. So it's a naturally occurring acid that we consume uh, almost daily in our diet. Traditionally, oxalic acid was used for bleaching wood. It was a product that a lot of carpenters used to clean off their wood and make it clear and ready for whatever project they're working on. But as beekeepers, we have now realized that it's another tool that we could use, and we often use it and find it most frequently in a crystal form. And when this all started to come about, the joke was it's probably the only fine white powder that we could sell as beekeepers legally in little packets, clear packets on the corner to other beekeepers because it does have that appearance to it. But it is toxic for sure. It's just like many of the other chemicals we're using in a concentrated form. It's toxic. It can be toxic to us, but more importantly, or semi more importantly, is that it's 70 times more toxic to the mites than it is to the bees, which is good because when we're trying to kill a bug on a bug, so to speak, we need something that's going to kill the problem, but not the host. And that's where this oxalic comes into play. So out of all the all of the organic acids that we use out there, it is the strongest organic acid. It's 10,000 times stronger than acetic acid in vinegar. And vinegar that we use is a 5% solution of acetic acid. And if you look at this list here, and some of these slides come directly from Randy Oliver. Randy was uh, very nice enough to send me his presentation years ago and allowed me to use slides out of that. So some of these may look familiar if you're familiar with Randy Oliver's presentations. But if you look up here at the very top, the oxalic acid is the strongest. Citric acid, which we recognize from the lemons and limes and stuff that we would consume with adult beverages, is in the middle. And then, of course, formic acid we're familiar with because it's a miticide that we use. It's down low. And we all know how strong formic acid is. Oxalic acid is that much stronger, but in a different form. It's probably not as harmful as formic can be on our bees. So, why oxalic acid? What's so great about oxalic acid that we are continuing to focus on this product, if you will? Like I said, it's been used since 2000, early 2000s in Europe, and it's kind of come across the ocean. Um, but it's a new tool, right? We're constantly struggling to fight mites in our hives, and we're always looking for that latest, greatest thing. And oxalic acid seems to always be that latest and greatest. Formic acid came out, we use it. It's fallen by the wayside. We still use it. It's kind of been a staple in our bee boxes. But oxalic acid seems to always catch the eye of old beekeepers, new beekeepers, and everybody in between. So it's going to always be that new tool, right? And we have to remember it's a tool. It's not the silver bullet that's going to kill every single mite out there, but it's a tool during certain times of the year for our colonies, depending on the situation. The very nice thing about oxalic acid is that there's no real temperature threshold. So if you compare that to formic acid, for instance, formic acid has a low threshold, temperature threshold of about 52 degrees, an upper threshold of about 85 degrees. If you look at Apigard, which is thymol, has a bottom temperature threshold of 50 degrees, an upper threshold of 105 degrees. But the downside about Apigard is you can't use it with supers. Formic acid you can use with supers. With oxalic, it's very effective no matter what. So again, comparing to formic, it has those temperature thresholds at the upper levels, 85 degrees. It's very effective, but it can also be very deadly towards our brood and our queens and things like that. Not as effective at the lower threshold, yet still useful. In oxalic acid, the temperature threshold doesn't matter. whether it's 40 degrees or whether it's 400. Well, 400, I guess the bees will die. But if it's 40 degrees or 90 degrees outside, oxalic acid is effective when used properly. It's a very short treatment time. As the length of time it takes us to put in there, and then maybe a day or two afterwards for the oxalic to work, is all it takes, compared to a 14-day treatment with formic, a 42-day treatment with apivar, a 14 or 21-day treatment with thymol. So the treatment time is very short, which is very crucial for many beekeepers when they're trying to get something done in between honey flows, in between adding supers and taking supers off, or requeening, or putting a new swarm in a box. Those treatment times really play a role in how we manage our colonies. And if used correctly, it has a minimal damage to our colony compared to some of the other products out there. Apivar, which is amitraz, can potentially have resistance. Formic acid, we know, will kill brood. So in this case, with oxalic, yes, it has its negative aspects, but it is fairly safe when used correctly. And going back to that, this is one of Randy's slides. Formic and thymol might be too strong. You may not need something that heavy in your colonies that would potentially damage brood, like you see here with the circled, the red circles. Sometimes formic will kill bees before they come out of the cell. You have deformed wing virus, which indicates a high mite load, but your temperatures might be too high. So oxalic fits that nice little niche that's in between a lot of the other products that we use. So again, we talk about some of the pros and cons with oxalic acid. First and foremost, cost. Two things that beekeepers are: they're cheap and they're impatient, right? We want something done right away, regardless of what the bees are telling us, and we don't want to pay a lot of money to do it. So the nice thing is oxalic is fairly inexpensive overall. The price per colony is typically in the cents instead of the dollars, like formic or apivar or even thymol, for that sense. It's effective, as we keep saying. It's natural and organic. So those of you who don't want to be more of a conventional beekeeper and get into the harsh chemicals, it does put you more towards the organic aspect of things, where you're using natural products. Since oxalic acid is a naturally found component, just like formic acid, we could keep within our organic standards safely. And the nice thing is it's acceptable for all size beekeepers, small scale, sideline, commercial. It's a product that's very useful across the board, across the industry, which is fantastic. The negative aspects of it, of course, is there's a health concern. Just like many of the other products that we use, there is that fine print on the label that says don't do this, this may involve, blindness, hearing loss, death, diarrhea, and everything else, right? So there are some negative aspects, and the biggest thing is your lungs, especially when you vaporize it. It's very harsh and can cause permanent lung damage. So there are health concerns if you don't use it properly. It can be hard on the bees and brood when used incorrectly, right? More is not necessarily always better. And you could use that improperly if you think that more is better. So we have to be very careful about mixing into syrup. We might have to be careful about vaporizing and having a product that's not vaporized correctly. There's a lot of these different things. And of course, depending on your technique or the method used, it can be time intensive. It may take you 5 to 10 minutes per colony instead of 30 seconds, depending on what we do. And we'll get into that. The most important thing you have to remember with oxalic acid and any other mite treatment is to read the label. The label is the law. That's going to tell you what's going on. So how do we use oxalic acid? There's a lot of beekeepers that are gun shy about it because they hear about the potential lung issues. They hear about it being an acid. So there are some concerns. But you have to understand that using it, like every other product, does have its parameters. And if you follow those recommendations, you'll be fine. It's a very safe product. But it's also important for beekeepers to understand that the registration and legal use of oxalic in the United States for beekeeping is only through the product called Apibioxol, right? Apibioxol is put out by Vita Pharma. And oxalic acid is the active ingredient of Apibioxol. So I know there's beekeepers out there that will go out and they buy stuff off the shelves of hardware stores and they order online because it's more and cheaper and this and that. Whatever you do is you do you, as the saying goes. But keep in mind that with the federal regulations, it is illegal for you to use anything other than the registered product called AP-bioxol. And I know and people don't. That's neither here nor there. Just keep in mind that we are here to promote the proper use of the proper ingredient called AP-bioxol, which is oxalic acid. So we talk about the safety concerns. This is a corrosive acid. Acids and bases. We learned those in elementary school or middle school chemistry. Oxalic acid is corrosive, which means if you splash some on your shirt or you leave it on some surface, there is that potential that it can corrode that surface. So you always want to use gloves and eye protection. You don't want to get it splashed. It'll burn if you get it in your eyes. You need to have a respirator rated for organic vapors. That's a must if you're going to do vaporization. And the nice thing is these products can be found pretty much anywhere. You can order them on Amazon. You can go to Home Depot, Lowe's. There's a lot of Uline is another place that has them. But all you need to do is find a half. These are called half face mask respirators, and you just have to look for the respirator cartridges that are rated for OV, which is organic vapors. There's other hazards, right? Combustion, poisonous gases. As a dust or solution, it can cause burns of eyes, mucous membranes, etc. Sure, I mean this stuff scares you, and it should because you want to use it properly. As Landy mentioned, I also own a pest control business, so I'm a certified pesticide applicator, and we're dealing with chemicals that And I tell my technicians, you have to follow this. This isn't we always say, I'm not telling you for your health, but in this case, we're telling you for your health because a lot of these products can be dangerous if not used correctly. So just keep those types of things in mind. First aid, they tell you to wash it off. So you want to keep water in hand or nearby if you have an accident. Again, these things aren't meant to scare you, just to point out that it is a serious product that you don't want to treat just haphazardly and do whatever for whatever works. So as we move forward here, let's talk about how oxalic works. And at this point, we really don't know. We are almost 6-7 years into it. There were guys using oxalic acid long before it became legal in the United States. And initially, there was some thought that, bees ingested that oxalic acid, the mites fed on them and ingested the oxalic acid that way. That kind of got thrown out the window. The current theory, and maybe it's changed a little bit, but I don't think it's changed a whole lot, is the current theory is that the direct contact of oxalic acid on varroa mite kills the mites, not through the ingestion via the mite into the bee. They're thinking more it absorbs through the pads of the feet on the mites, and as they come in contact with that oxalic, it kills them that way. There's a lot of research that has to be done. The important thing is we know that it kills the mites a lot faster than it kills the bees, and that's the important part. We also know that higher doses of solution, if you're using the dribble method, which we'll talk about here shortly, reaches its maximum potential killing power at 4.2%, which is a very hot solution. And we'll talk about those solutions here in the next couple of slides. So right now, there's only 2 approved application methods. 3 if you kind of go into the gray area, but we're going to talk about the 2 that are used most commonly. One is called the dribble method, and the second method is called sublimation, which more commonly in the bee industry is called vaporization. If you're a chemist, you know that it's not technically vaporizing. It's the correct term is sublimation, but vaporization's taken over the bee world, so we'll use those 2 terms interchangeably here throughout this talk. So first and foremost, and the most common probably, or it used to be common, now I think we've switched, it was the dribble method. And the dribble method was very common early on because the vaporization, sublimation, scared a lot of people, right? Possibly inhaling that stuff and causing permanent lung damage scared the bejesus out of people. So the dribble method was very common. And this was back when we knew very little about our bees and how the oxalic acid affected them. But I think as we've moved forward over these last several years, we're seeing equal amounts of dribble and vaporization, and we're probably actually edging towards more vaporization because of the ease of it, and we don't have to mix up a bunch of stuff. But in the dribble method, basically the equipment that's needed is oxalic acid, sugar, distilled water, a 60 cc syringe, some nitrile gloves. Remember, iron glove hand protection, your safety glasses or goggles to prevent that from splashing. And the application of this method is pretty simple. You're going to mix up a 1 liter solution of 35 grams of oxalic acid with 1 liter of 1-to-1 sugar syrup solution. You're going to take 5 milliliters of that solution per seam of bees. Ultimately, it boils down to 5 to 50 cc's or 50 milliliters per colony, regardless of whether it's a nuke, a single deep, or multiple brood boxes. They're recommending that 50 cc's or 50 mils is the maximum dose. It's best used when the colony is in a loose cluster, but not free flying. So I'm not sure what your temperatures are out there today. Here in Pittsburgh, we reached 78 degrees. Not a good day to do dribble method because a lot of your bees are out foraging. There are some bees on the inside. The dribble method is best used when you have a semi-tight cluster, when you're about 40, 45, maybe 50 degrees, when the bees aren't quite flying, but they are moving around within the colony. And of course, it's most effective when the bees are broodless or where there's no closed brood. So you could have open brood, but no closed brood, because as with some of these other products that we also use, they don't kill the mites under the capping. So they're killing the phoretic mites that are attached to the bees. So it's most effective when you have no brood and the majority of mites are on the bees itself. And as I heard Landy mention earlier, Thanksgiving is that kind of calendar date to do things, but we're actually starting to treat our bees now because our bees here in western half of Pennsylvania are shutting down. We don't have any open brood. We've got just a little bit of cap brood left, and everything's pretty much dying. We haven't had any frost yet, but our bees are shutting down in that case. So when we mix the solution, and I probably should have put this slide a little bit before, the normal, most common solution that we're using is 35 grams of oxalic acid into a 1 liter solution will treat approximately 20 colonies, right? And that 1 liter solution is just 1-to-1 sugar syrup, nothing fancy. You also have to remember that the oxalic acid crystals will dissolve better when it's in warm water rather than in a sugar solution. So the way we do that is we dissolve the oxalic first into the distilled water. And the reason we use distilled is if you use well water or tap water, sometimes there's chemicals in there or minerals that cause the oxalic acid to particulate out, right? So it doesn't give you a really smooth solution. So distilled water, 1-to-1 sugar or 1-to-1 sugar to water, dissolve the oxalic acid into the water, then add the sugar after that. It mixes very nicely. Once everything's fully dissolved, you could go ahead and apply it directly to the bees. You don't have to wait for it to chill. 120 to 140 degrees is a hot tap water. By the time you mix it and get it to your beehives, it's going to be cool enough that you don't have to worry about harming the bees in that sense. This chart can actually be found on Randy Oliver's website, and this has probably been tweaked a little bit by Randy, and you could probably get the updated version there. But basically, this is his mixing chart for mixing oxalic acid for the dribble method. And typically, as a backyard beekeeper, we're probably going to be in that second or third column, 20 colonies to 33 colonies. But he tells you right here we have a weak solution, a medium solution, and a hot solution. Most beekeepers tend to mix up a weak or a moderate solution. Hot can do some damage to both brood and to your adult bees. Maybe if you have a really high mite load that you haven't been able to get under control, you'll use that. But if you're really just focusing on broodless periods and using oxalic as a cleanup, you're going to stay in the weak or moderate categories, and I typically just stick with the moderate. If I'm doing any type of dribble method, the moderate tends to do me well when I'm mixing that up and treating my colonies. So here's our application method. We want those bees in a loose cluster, and you can see, just judging by the cluster, it's colder outside. The bees are formed in this nice cluster going into the winter. They look healthy. They have a lot of honey that's in that colony. And basically all we're doing here, and you can see the cluster here as well. Now this is a different colony, but you can see the loose outline of the cluster on the upper super, and you could see the bees down below. This was done for just demonstration purposes. That super was removed once we did this, but it was meant to just point out how you would break open a top box from the bottom box, and you want to treat where the bulk of the bees are. So if the bulk of the bees are on the bottom, you're going to do that dribble 5 cc's per seam of bees. If there's still a lot of bees on top in the upper brood box, you put that box down and basically split your dosage between the two of them. 25 cc's down below, 25 cc's up above. And you got to do your best to try to cover as many bees as possible with that oxalic acid. The idea behind that is when you dribble it over all of the bees are in a loose cluster, so they're moving around, they're spreading it from bee to bee, which then gives the contact to the mites, and then they die from that. So pros and cons to the dribble method. It's very safe, right? There's no vapors to inhale. We don't need a lot of special equipment. You could buy natural gloves anywhere. You could buy safety glasses anywhere. The syringes you could buy at any vet store, Tractor Supply, online, right? Amazon's great for that quick click, and they have it right next, the next day on your doorsteps. You can mix it fairly quickly, and it's minimal treatment time, right? And it helps if you have 2 people with you. One cracks the box, one applies it, you move on to the next one. The downside to that is that mixture has a very limited lifespan. Once you mix it, you typically need to use it within a few days, because the sugar will break down into HMF, which is hydromethylfluoro something, and I always mess it up when I say it, but HMF is the short term. It's a byproduct of sugar when it breaks down and ferments, and it can kill your bees. So it's a very limited lifespan. You might have to lift your hive bodies to gain access to the cluster, and again, it only works on your phoretic mites. It does not work under cap brood. So now we move on to the other approved method, which is sublimation, or vaporization, as we often call it. And the method behind this is fairly straightforward as well. Basically, you're using 1 gram of crystals per deep hive body. So if you're running double deeps, it's 2 grams. If you're running all mediums, we use that equation of 3 mediums or equivalent of 2 deeps. And the more recent research is showing us that you really can't overdose a colony with oxalic acid vaporization. In fact, Jennifer Berry, I think, just came out here a little while ago to say that, even though they say 1 gram per hive body, sometimes 3 or 4 gives you a better, fuller vaporization, which results in a higher mite kill. The nice thing is with oxalic acid, the label itself does not tell you specifically you're limited to 1 gram, but it is a recommendation by several organizations that you only use 1 gram per hive body. So you have to kind of wade into that gray area on your own. The good news is there is guidance, and it's very easy to follow. You do need to use a vaporizer, which can be fairly costly depending on the model that you use. That would also require that you have some type of power source, whether it's electric or whether it's a battery. You also need to have that respirator that's rated for organic vapors. And this is nice because it can be used during broodless and brood present time periods. The downside, of course, is that when you have brood present, your mites are under the cappings, a third or more of your bees are out foraging. So there are some drawbacks, but because it's not as harsh on the bees as the dribble method, you could tend to use this a little bit more, which is nice, so there's some flexibility in here. And I see there's some questions in the chat, and I'll get to those at the end, I think is what I'll do. But feel free to put them in there. So moving on with sublimation / vaporization, as I mentioned with the equipment that you need, obviously oxalic acid, you need a measuring spoon, you need some type of power source. Depending on your vaporizer, you might need a wet or damp towel to try to cool that vaporizer down a little bit faster. You need something to close the openings. You need a timer. You need the respirator, all this stuff. So a lot more equipment is needed for vaporization. But it does give you a little bit more versatility when you need to vaporize. So as far as application is concerned, in this case, instead of cracking the hive open, the hive remains intact. We're going to restrict the entrance at the bottom. We're going to slide the vaporizer in following the manufacturer's directions. You're going to seal up any openings and cracks to kind of minimize the escape of vapor. Although I don't take the time to tape everything up, because it actually gives me it's an indicator. It tells me that my vapor has permeated the entire colony. When I start to see it coming out the cracks in the top of the hive, I know I got a good vaporizing on it. You're going to use that guidance of 1 gram of oxalic per brood chamber. Again, following the directions of the manufacturer for your specific vaporizer. Generally, you're putting it through the bottom entrance. You're going to heat up that vaporizer until the oxalic acid has sublimated, which is the conversion of a solid to a gas, generally a few minutes, and then you're done. Pretty straightforward. There's different techniques, of course, and we won't go into them in detail, but just understand that every vaporizer has a slightly different way of doing things. For the standard vaporizers, and I'll show you a picture of what I consider a standard vaporizer. These are the ones that you have to allow to heat up for 2.5 to 3 minutes, let it vaporize, and then it has to cool back down, right? There's no constant feed of oxalic acid like there is in some of the other models. But these ones, you have to let them heat up. You have to let them cool back down. You have to close off the entrance, let it sit, cool off the vaporizer, repeat. So your treatment time is still short, but it can be a little longer in general, depending on the type of manufactured vaporizer that you're using. So here's one of the standard vaporizers. We have a power source going into the hive. Again, this was for demo purposes only at the time. So, and we'll get into the super issue here later on in this talk, but we're showing that you have to close off the entrance, you have to let it heat up, vaporize, and then cool back down. There's also the more commercial vaporizers, which kind of allow a constant feed of oxalic acid, if you will. The vaporizer itself does not need to heat up and cool down. The unit is constantly heated, and you're delivering that oxalic acid in a way that as soon as it hits, it vaporizes, and your application method is much, much shorter. So instead of 5 or 7 minutes, you're down to about 45 seconds to a minute with these more commercial vaporizers. So you're getting a faster turnaround. You still have to insert it in the bottom. You have to close off openings so that you get a good sublimation within the colony, but it is quicker, so you can do more colonies much faster. Excuse me. So this is one of the big commercial vaporizers. This is made by VM Vaporizer. Big, bulky unit. This one actually uses an air compressor, a generator. It really cranks out the oxalic acid. It's meant to do a lot of hives quickly, but it's also very pricey. You're talking, I think, somewhere around $2,500 or maybe $3,500 now for a big unit like this. There are commercial beekeepers that are out there and use it. I had one. I was using it. Just too much for me. So I actually sold it and switched. We go back to some of the more standard vaporizers that are out there. This is the Vero or the Verox made by Oxavap. So, and this is the hyalizer, and the hyalizer versus the Verox are very similar, but they're also slightly different. So the Verox is the same type of standard vaporizer as the hyalizer. The difference being is their material. So this is made out of steel, stainless steel. This is made out of aluminum. The Verox, you could sublimate. You could take that wand out, dunk it in cold water, and dry it off, put the oxalic right back in, vaporize very quickly. The hyalizer is aluminum, which means you have to let it cool down on its own. If you dump that thing in water, it'll crack and your unit is now useless. So same type of treatment, 2.5, 3 minutes, it heats up. The difference being this Verox you can cool down. This one you have to let it cool down. Cost wise, you're probably in the $200 range for the Verox, probably 150 or so for the hyalizer. And this is what it looks like when the oxalic vaporizes. You go from a solid to a gaseous state. Going back into the more commercial style vaporizers, this is the ProVap 110, which is probably the most common and most popular style of quote unquote commercial vaporizers. Commercial people are using it, sideliners are using it, and if you're willing to invest in it, the backyarders are using it too. That is several $100s. I forget what the actual price tag is these days, but basically what happens is this unit crucible, it heats up and maintains a very, very high temperature. You put your oxalic in this white cap. You turn the unit upside down to put the cap on, and when you turn it right side up, you tap that cap and it releases, heats up, vaporizes instantaneously. And when you're done, you take it out of the hive, you take off the white cap, you refill the white cap, turn it back, flip it back over, refill it, and you're done. So the crucible is maintained at a high temperature constantly. So you have a quicker turnaround time versus this model. You have to let it heat up and then you could dunk it and cool it off quicker, but then you have to let it heat back up again. So there's definitely some pros and cons to the various units that are out there. This is another more sideliner style of the Oxavap. So we have the ProVap 110. They came out with the ProVap Easy 110, which is a very similar product. The nice thing is you don't have to bend over. It's a very long tube. You see these two capsules here that you could actually prime with oxalic acid. You slide that capsule down the tube. It hits the stop down here, delivers the oxalic acid, and poof, it vaporizes. So the same thing, this unit is kept at a very high temperature constantly. There's no slowdown. You don't have to wait for things to reheat. You're just basically refilling these capsules to deliver your oxalic acid. That's running about 500, maybe more than that, probably around 600 or 700 now. I'd have to look. I have one of those. I love it. It's an electrical power source. So I run it off a generator, but it's a fantastic unit. The newest product that just came out here early this year is the Verox Eddy. This is a rechargeable battery. So no cords. This whole battery will last you for about 10 to 15 applications. Back here at this upper end is where we apply the oxalic acid, and that there's a metal cup there that's replaceable. So they give you two with the product, and this product does have to heat up another 2 to 3 minutes before it vaporizes. To cool it down, you just swap out the heated cup with a cooler cup. So your turnaround time is quicker than the original style, not as quick as the ProVap 110 or the ProVap Easy 110, but it is very quick. And again, the nice thing, it's portable, it's rechargeable. The downside is about $500. But if you have a yard that you don't want to carry batteries to, and you only have 10 hives or so, this will get you through. All these products are on oxavap.com. There's YouTube videos on them. I've done a review on this. It's a great product. I love it. I have one. I lend it out to the backyarders to use because I have a different product that I'm using. That's what the product would look like when we're treating and vaporizing within the colony itself. So there are pros and cons to vaporization as well. It can be used fairly frequently, right? It's not as harsh on bees as the dribble method. You don't need to lift or move equipment. Essentially, you're plugging your entrances, and that's all there is to it. You're not mixing anything. You can take your container of oxalic acid from AP Bioxol and take it right out to the yard, do your thing, and be done with it. The negative aspects, of course, it's very dangerous, right? You need a lot more equipment. It's more expensive equipment. Uh, Slightly longer treatment time compared to the dribble method because of the heating and cooling aspect of it, but it's probably negligible when you compare them side by side. And again, it only works on phoretic mites. So when do we apply oxalic acid? This is the big question. Everybody wants to know how to use it because it's a special miticide. Everybody, how do I use it? When do I use it? How fast can I use it? Ideally, we're using it during brood breaks. Again, it's most effective during a broodless cycle. So whether you're doing an application when you're requeening your colonies in the summer, if you do that type of thing, or you're applying it at the late season when the queen is shutting down, those are great times to do it. You could use it on packages and swarms. Packages are great to do the dribble method on prior to installation. You could also catch swarms, dump them in a box, and within the first 7 days, as the queen begins to lay, you could do a dribble method or even a vaporization because you have no brood. So you're able to knock down those mites and get a clean slate prior to these packages and swarms even taking off. And of course, we just mentioned the late fall or even the early spring may work when there's very little to no brood present in order for it to work effectively and efficiently. These next few slides are from Randy Oliver, but it kind of shows you, why brood breaks are important. You could create your own brood break by making artificial splits or caging the queen for 2 weeks so she shuts down. There's beekeepers out there that this is part of their management plan. A lot of beekeepers have trouble keeping up with what they're already doing. So to try to induce a brood break can be costly to the beekeeper in terms of a failed requeening event or a weak split. But if you're the type of beekeeper that likes to use brood breaks, the application of oxalic acid during that brood break can be very beneficial to that colony. We talked about packages. We talked about broodless nukes. If you're creating new nukes and adding new queens, that time before the cat brood shows up is very important when you're using oxalic acid. Again, remember, oxalic acid does not penetrate the capping. So you have to wait when there's no brood present or no capped brood. Again, from Randy Oliver, and this has probably changed a little bit, but the general idea is still pretty rock solid. If we come in with a oxalic acid treatment and there's no brood present in that colony, whether it's a swarm or in the winter, you can see the effects here where you go from a high mite count, one treatment, no brood present, no capped brood present, and that mite level drops, right? If we look at a colony that has a full-blown brood nest, cat brood, open brood, everything's functioning, middle of the summer, middle of a honey flow, we might knock the mites down a little bit, but remember, upwards of 70% of the mite load in a colony can be present underneath the cappings. So you're missing a whole lot of mites and you're knocking down the phoretics, but then that cat brood emerges and boom, your mite load kicks back up again and you're back to where you started, if not worse. If you look at a treatment when this all came out, they said, well, just treat once every week and you'll be okay. No matter whether there's brood or not, once a week will do it. Well, Randy shows us the data. Yeah, you're knocking mites down and you will continue to knock them down over a period of time. But look at this, over 2 months, your results are really not positive, right? I mean, you're knocking mites down, but you're really not getting the ones that are under the caps. So what they're saying now is, when there's brood present, you almost have to do a treatment once every 4 to 5 days for about 4 to 5 weeks when there's brood present. That's going to take into consideration brood emerging, brood being recently capped, and you're going to cover that full life cycle of the queen laying her brood and having it emerge as adults. Going back to the package application, and this is kind of out of alignment here. It should have been earlier in the presentation, but some of you may have been asking, well, how do we treat a package? How's that different than a colony? Because they're in the screen box, and how do I access them? Really, it says ensure the bees are clustered before applying oxalic acid. typically when beekeepers are getting packages, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, it's early enough in the season that the temperatures are cooler. We have that dark, cold garage, or whatever it may be. The bees are going to be fairly clustered. We're going to use that weak solution, right? We saw that chart by Randy Oliver. It had a weak, a moderate, and a strong solution. We're going to use the weak solution of oxalic, mix it with your 35 grams of oxalic acid into 1 liter, that whole solution. And then we're just going to spray that, whether we spray it through the screen, whether you take the lid off the package and spray there. Basically, coat those bees with that oxalic acid, let them sit for 24 to 48 hours. It'll kill the mites, install the bees, you're good to go. The other alternative, which probably might be a little bit safer because you let the bees do what bees do in terms of gathering pollen, etc., during the day, install them into the hive, and then within a week to 2 weeks of installing, prior to the presence of capped brood, you could either vaporize and dribble that colony. Even though it's a new package, it'll help you get a clean slate. Penn State did a little study here a few years ago looking at the amount of mites in packages, and they found that it was all over the board. Some packages had high mite loads, some had 0 mites on them. Even in colonies that beekeepers claimed were treated prior to being shaken. So it's always a good thing if you are a package type of a beekeeper. You may want to treat your hives prior to or after installation to get yourself on a clean slate. More importantly is, do not use oxalic acid as that silver bullet. Practice a rotation of treatments. Even if it's the same rotation year after year, don't use oxalic acid straight up 12 months out of the year. Maybe use formic in the spring and then thymol in the summer, and then oxalic in the winter. Whatever works for you. There's a lot of ways to do that. Your management style and your management method is going to be heavily influenced by the chemicals you're willing to use, the chemicals you've had success with, and the chemicals that are available to you at the time. Let's pass through all that. There's some little tricks and tools out there as well. If you are a handy person or know somebody that's handy with putting things together, this is a nice, easy way to bypass your power issue. So basically what we've done here, this is a friend of mine that put this together. He's got some alligator clips which connect to your ATV battery, your garden tractor battery, your vehicle, your truck, car, whatever it may be. On one end is a female outlet. So you plug in your a short extension cord. The other end goes into your oxalic vaporizer, and you basically are using the battery off your vehicle to run that vaporizer. So you don't have to run a 500-foot extension cord. You don't have to carry a heavy tractor battery around. You don't have to worry about generators. So there's a lot of neat little tricks out there that you can kind of do workarounds on when it comes to it. So here's a picture of it connected to my truck battery, connected to the extension. The extension goes to 2 connectors, and then what I do is have another section that I didn't show you here, but it connects my alligator clips on my vaporizer to that block, and then the vaporizer goes in. So this is just one of many different ways to look at things, but keep an open mind and think how you could work around some of these little challenges that are out there. So as we move through this, and we're getting close to the end here, but this is the big question because it just happened this year, is can you use oxalic acid with supers on, right? The big thing came out earlier this winter, I think it was February or March, that said, hey, we could use supers now. And the answer at that point was no, not really. What had happened early in the season was that they had put in an application to be able to change the label in order to use oxalic acid with supers. Fast forward through today, and this came straight out of the horse's mouth with a friend of mine that works in DC and is involved in all this. The answer is yes, you could use oxalic with supers on. However, right, the big but, you have to have the product that contains either a supplemental label or the new label that states that it can be used with supers on, which means any of that product that we had from last year left over, we technically cannot use that product with supers on because the label does not say that. And this stirs a big debate. It stirs a lot of arguments about, well, who's going to know? The government's not going to know. They're not going to know. You're right. I mean, who's going to know? Nobody's going to call the federal government and say, hey, Landy didn't use the right label. The point of it is that we want to be responsible beekeepers. We want to make sure that we're putting on a good example, and we don't abuse the abilities and the products that we have available. So old product cannot be used. The new label that's coming out can be used. And if you've noticed, there's a lot of back-ordered AP bioxol on a lot of the beekeeping sites. Part of that is because of just supply chain issues, and some of that is getting the new labels up and running. The important thing is the label is the law. If you have old product that doesn't show supers, technically you can't use it. The new labels will show that. So here's the two new labels that are coming out, and these are just a portion of the label. But the main label shows right here, it says oxalic acid dihydrate. The new label was accepted back at the end of April of this year. So you'll see that on new product. And then on the right, you see the supplemental labeling. And some products will have this. As long as it has either one of those labels on it, that'll be fine. But as you go down the label itself, here on the main label, it says right here, oxalic acid can be used when honey supers are on the hive. And on the supplemental label, it says right here, did I copy the wrong? Oh, yeah, here they are. Oxalic acid can be used when supers are on the hive. It's coming. So if you don't have the product with the new label yet, it's coming down the pike, and all the new stuff coming out will allow us to use oxalic with supers on, which is great because that gives us a lot of flexibility during the spring, summer, and even the winter when we have supers on and we don't want to have to remove them and then put them back on when we're doing treatment, and it just becomes a pain in the butt. So some of the frequently asked questions, actually, I think I missed a slide here. Oh, no, I didn't. Okay. And I'll give you the website for this. And I copied these off of the DEP's website, or is it DEP? I forget what the website. ARS is who I took it from. But anyways, there's some frequently asked questions that are very common that we hear with this new oxalic acid labeling law. So one is, when can I start applying it with supers on? And again, it goes back to the label, right? The USDA is the one that's pursuing this. As soon as those new labels are processed and put on the product, we could use it. Technically, as it stands right now, we cannot use the old product with supers on. What product can you use? Again, AP bioxol is the only EPA recognized oxalic acid product. Yes, there's other oxalic acid out there. The problem is you don't know what the purity rate is. You don't know what's mixed in with it, what kind of impurities. And again, going back to the label is the law. And I know some people don't like to hear that, but label is the law. You have to apply it the way the label reads. If not, yes, somebody can get in trouble. Will we? We don't want to know. I mean, it's, by law to federal law, yes, we can get in trouble for doing it that way. You have existing stocks of old product. Can you use it? Again, no, right? We have to wait for the new product to come out. And that sucks, but that's the way it is. The good news is the product is cheap, so not a complete loss. And the biggest question, and I'm glad I saw this on here because I had somebody say this to me, is that they'll just print a copy of the new label. And as long as you have that label in hand, you could use it with all your other product. And that is not the case. You have to have the product in the container that it was sold in, and that label has to be in that container, on that container. You can't take it and put it in the Ziploc baggies technically and carry it out and do whatever you need to do. By law, the label has to be attached to the container that that product is in. Let's see here. Application methods. This is another thing that I'm glad that they came up and said. We hear about a lot of different methods out there. Shop towels, using glycerin for dribble method. I know Randy's testing a lot of different ways. He will tell you this, and he will agree that those methods are not approved. He's testing them. It doesn't mean that you go out and use them. I mean, he mentioned the blue towel method. There was a run on blue towels on every Amazon site out there, every auto store, because everybody rushed out to get the blue shop towels and drench them in oxalic. Meanwhile, the results weren't even out yet. And what did he do? He came out and said, well, yeah, blue shop towels may not work that well. I'm going to use chipboard. So he used chipboard, and everybody went out and bought chipboard. Then he went back to towels. Then he's looking at those meat pads. So he's doing the work for us. We need to be patient and let him do it, do the testing, do the result. And then eventually he's going to find a product that he'll go and try to get the label changed again once more that will allow us to use this in a proper manner. But for now, unless it's listed on the label, all other application methods are unapproved. Here's the link. It's a big link. I don't expect anybody to write this down, but if you just type in USDA oxalic acid frequently asked questions, it'll pop right up top of the list, and you could read through all of that. And it gives a lot of great information on that website about oxalic acid, and it even references some other sites as well. Acknowledgements: Randy Oliver. He was generous enough to allow me to utilize parts of his presentation, because Randy does it great. He's spot on with a lot of that stuff, and his information is really out there. So I really appreciate Randy allowing me to borrow his slides, or some of them at least. And of course, shameless advertising. It's nothing to do with oxalic acid, but I'm here. So Swarm Essentials is my book that I'm most known for. They can be ordered through wickwaspress.com. You can order it through Meadowsweet Apiaries, or I'm sorry, meadowsweetbees.com. But if you're into swarms and I'm trying to understand them, that book is available out there for you. And with that, I'm going to give my voice a rest. I haven't come up with air, and I know I covered a lot of ground very quickly, but Landy, I'll turn it over to you. And if there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Okay. So who has questions?
I have a question. I don't quite understand the design of the vaporizers. Do the alligator clips that come at the end of that not allow for or have a sufficient reach if I was to drive my lawn tractor right next to the my colonies?
Yeah, good.
Why do we have to tinker with what's already there?
Yeah, great question. So there's such a wide variety of vaporizers out there. The cheaper models that slide into the colony base that you have to allow them to heat up and allow them to cool down typically come with about a 2 or 3 foot.
Steve, you're breaking up over there.
I'm breaking up?
Yeah. Oh, now you sound good.
Oh, okay. So what I was saying is that the various types of vaporizers will come in different configuration. So the cheapest models are the ones that slide into the hive, they heat up, cool down. They come with about 2 foot, or not even 3 feet, about a 2 foot section with alligator clips. So it doesn't, unless you pull your lawn tractor right up to the hive, you probably aren't going to have, you're probably not going to have the reach. So that little trick there to give yourself a little extension with the extension cord will help. It's also the reason why many beekeepers will invest in a little bit more pricier vaporizer, because you have a little bit more wiggle room with the length of cord, or if you go with the cordless type, you have complete freedom. So you have to really see which option fits your management style and your abilities, because some people can pull a ATV or lawn tractor right up to the hive. Some people don't want to get that close. So, excuse me.
Follow-up question: has there been a relative comparison in any of the beekeeping magazines of the different tools that are available at the moment, or is this something you would like to do now? You have the idea.
That's a great question. Yeah, so I have not seen a side-by-side comparison, but that's actually a good thing to do, to kind of do a pro versus con for at least the major types. We'll never get all of them, but that is something, whether I have time or Landy has time, that's something we'll have to look at, but that would be a good idea to get at least some of the, one of each of the major types and compare them for beekeepers, because it is confusing. There's a lot out there. There's also a lot of homemade versions out there that I don't recommend. Yes, they're cheap. You can buy them for $60, but what you don't hear about are the number of beekeepers that stopped using them because they burned up their hives, or the product just fell apart or wasn't working. So there's a lot of homemade ones out there. I stick to the ones that are manufactured that are high quality and that are proven. Somebody asked about the gas VAP, and one of the issues behind the gas VAP in any product really with oxalic acid, you have to be careful about the temperature at which it heats, how consistent that temperature is heating, how fast it heats, because if heated incorrectly, oxalic acid can turn to basically formic acid, and you don't get complete combustion, if you will, or complete sublimation, and you lose your efficacy. So now you're heating oxalic acid from a crystal form to a gaseous form, but if it doesn't heat correctly, it turns into formic acid, and formic acid vaporization hasn't been tested. We don't know what the effects are on bees. So there's a lot of things you got to be careful with some of these other products out there. You got to look at the company's data and say, hey, yeah, this company shows that it takes me 1 minute and to go from 0 to 242 degrees Celsius, and it's consistently heating to that. There's a thermostat that shows me that, whereas some of these other products, there's no thermostat. So how do you know how hot they're getting? Is it getting too hot? Not hot enough? So those are some of the things you have to pay attention to. But that's a great point, is to try to do a comparison here in the future.
So Steve, I've got a couple of questions for you. One, when I started doing oxalic acid vaporization, I used the 3M cartridge in my half face mask, rated for organic vapors. And then someone pointed out to me that, oxalic acid is an acid. And there is a cartridge made for organic acids. So I now use that rather than the organic vapor cartridge. Are you saying, though, that the organic vapor cartridge is adequate?
I'm not saying that. The EPA is saying that. But yeah, you're right. I'll have to look into that, though, because I know, yes, it's an organic acid, but I think it has to do with the type of particulate in terms of once it turns into vapor. So there's a pesticide that I use that it's phosphide gas basically, but it goes from a solid tablet to a gas, and I have to use a organic acid mask for that, like you're saying. But EPA is saying organic vapor, so I'm not sure oxalic acid is that potent, if you will, that requires that next level organic acid cartridge. Those are expensive. Not quite as the organic vapor cartridge is cheaper. But I'm gonna have to look into that. That's good. EPA says organic vapor, so it's on them. But I'm gonna look into that now that you mentioned that. That's a good question.
Yeah, I think my lungs are more expensive than those cartridges.
Well, I agree, but beekeepers are cheap and impatient. So, what are you gonna do?
Okay, I have a second question for you.
Okay,
we've talked about this in the past, and you know that way back when the researchers started playing around with organic acid, I was working with Medhat Nasser, who was in New Jersey at the time, not up in Canada, and wanted me to run some experiments using oxalic acid dribble on some of my colonies. And at one point, I picked 84 colonies, okay, as an experiment. Half of them I treated with organic acid dribble, pretty much exactly the way you described it, okay? The other half I did not. I did this during, I think, early December. We had a fairly warm period in early December, and I went through, treated every other hive in a bunch of apiaries with the dribble and did not treat the alternate hives. And I got a mortality on the treated hives of something like 53%. Okay, they didn't make it through the winter. The untreated hives, the mortality was around 20-something, low 20%. So, I was able, I ran the statistics and was able to conclude at a 95% confidence level, organic acid, that dribble method applied that way kills bees. And one thing that you didn't really discuss much, and the question really is, can you please discuss a little bit more, what are the effects on the bees, particularly of the dribble method, which I think is indeed a lot harsher on them than the vaporization. Can you talk about that a little bit, please?
So I shouldn't mention the user error for that season. I'm kidding. No, so yeah, Landy brings up a good point, and I remember that discussion, and that was she got mad at me when I told her it was user error. But oxalic acid is a harsh chemical. There's no doubt about it, and it's also a reason why. And I kind of hinted at this and touched on it a little bit, is that the dribble comes in direct contact at a higher dosage, if you will, than the vaporization. So it's also why the guidance tells you that the dribble should only be used once a year, so to speak, or once a season, in that you don't want to do a dribble on your bees in late November and then do it again in February just because that the bees are already stressed. You have you may have a colony that has a high mite load or that was affected by a high mite load prior to your treatment, so they're stressed from that. They're stressed from their winter. They're trying to rebuild in the spring with the queen rearing. So if you're constantly hitting these adult bees, you do run the risk of knocking your adult population back. Versus vaporization, yes, they're coming in contact with the oxalic crystals, but it's not as harsh on their exoskeleton as the dribble is. And I think we're still finding out the science behind all of that, exactly why, but we know that it is harsh enough that we don't want to do a dribble method multiple times just because. If you're going to do a dribble in November, maybe just do a vaporization in February if you need to. There is some part of that with Landy, and this is Landy and I discussed this a little bit, is yes, the data comes out and says it was, statistically significant that the oxalic acid dribble caused more mortality. But what we don't know prior to that was what the mite loads were in each colony that she treated, the actual population size. I mean, there's a lot of factors, how much stores it had. So there's a lot of other factors that could have played a role that influenced that outcome. But she is correct in that the dribble is harsh. So even though it's easier, you don't want to be doing that multiple times just because it's that harsh on the bees. So I think it's also why we're seeing more people lean towards the vaporization, where early on they were afraid of the vaporization and stuck the dribble. Now we're kind of swinging the other direction. And I think I'm hearing more people just stick to vaporization more than they are dribbling. But yeah, we can't emphasize enough that the dribble is harsher. There is some research out there, research data out there. I haven't had a chance to pull it up and add it to the talk, but we do know from anecdotal evidence and some of the research that dribble method is harsh, and that's why it's recommended to only do it once during the course of a winter. So,
Thanks, Steve. More questions, guys?
I think that's it, Steve.
everybody's heads. I'm curious. You guys are there. If you can get a show of hands from people, how many folks are using oxalic acid in some version?
We've got Landy's hand. And that's
Okay, Megan is.
okay. We've got Landy and Megan. That's it. That's all you
So
got.
is there 3 people in the crowd, or is there more than that?
Yeah, there's a few people here. Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask this then. I guess ask some of those people, why are they not using oxalic? Is it because they're too new to beekeeping, or are they afraid of something? Or I'm curious why people aren't using oxalic.
Myself, I have a routine which includes, or a protocol which includes bookending Apivar, the middle of the season, temperatures permitting, I use Swarm Pro. So I know some people, Landy says, use oxalic acid later in the season for cleanup. I have not yet bought a vaporizer, and I've been scared off by what you were saying about the harshness. I do have a 60 centimeter syringe. I used it once many years ago, but I got to it was too late into the phase of bees to do anything, and I never used it again.
Okay. Yeah, so it sounds like it's going back to the whole fear factor. And again, I don't want people to be afraid of oxalic acid. I mean, if I told you that your chances of dying in a car wreck are greater than whatever out there, I mean, you wouldn't drive, right? That's why we have seat belts. That's why we have airbags, etc. So, oxalic acid is one of those tools that, given the option, if somebody came up to me, if Landy came up to me and said, you could use Apivar, which is Amatraz, or you could use oxalic acid in your colonies at this time of year, we'll just say November, I would take oxalic acid hands down every single time. 1, Amatraz is expensive. 2, it sometimes shows resistance. 3, it's a 42-day treatment. I have to put them in, take them out, and I have to have a 2-week withdrawal before I put keepers back on. So don't let the vapor aspect of it scare you. As far as the cost is concerned, some of these clubs are purchasing vaporizers and lending them out to their members. We have groups of beekeepers in my area that 4 or 5 of them that live relatively close to each other will all pitch in and buy the vaporizer and share it amongst themselves, or they'll have the mite treatment day where they'll go around and treat everybody's hive. So there's lots of ways around it. Don't let the scare. Now, how do I put this? Don't let the scary stuff scare you. It's there for your safety, but oxalic acid is very safe using the correct respirator, following the manufacturer's directions, all that good stuff. So I think that's probably what we're hearing, Landy, and Justin. I think the fear factor really scares people, but we need to do a better job at kind of educating the positive aspects of that. Is, yes, it's dangerous, but using the right tools is very safe and very effective treatment in our colonies at certain times of the year.
Also, Steve, the equipment is expensive. So you just brought up a really good point, though. I'm wondering if we, as a club, were to purchase, one of the better end vaporizers, how many people would be interested in using it?
Hell yeah.
As long as I knew how to properly use it and had the education, so I felt,
Yeah, okay, so rates are going up, so that's something that we may, we could certainly discuss. We do have funds, we could conceivably do that, as long as nobody sued us if your bees die. Or your lungs,
So, Landy,
The battery is the best, because you can then have such ease, taking it from one hive to 2 different yards. with the battery charge.
Yeah, the battery,
That's a game
that's actually a really good idea, because
That's the game changer.
Yeah.
I wasn't using it because I'm not carting around a 12-volt battery or,
for a generator,
No, not at all.
so
But the battery charge is a game changer.
that does like 10 hives. Yeah, the rechargeable battery one. That's a
Yeah,
good idea.
So on that battery charging one, the rechargeable battery one, you could actually buy additional batteries for it as well. They're not cheap either. They're like $100 or something like that. But you could feasibly buy the charger plus 1 or 2 extra batteries. I think the charge time is about 2 hours, 2.5 hours on it. But you know, 1 or 2 extra spare batteries, you spend $700 on that whole product. It works very well. It's portable. And another thing we've talked about doing here, and I just haven't had the time to do it because it falls on me because nobody else wants to do it. You know, when you have a club vaporizer, you could also set it up so that in order to have that to utilize that vaporizer or have somebody use it on your hives, you have a training class that goes through the proper safety protocols, the procedures, make sure everybody has, that they sign a document that says, yes, I've been trained on the proper use of this piece of equipment. And then those people are the ones that are allowed to take it out, use it, or use it on somebody else's hives because they've been trained. So there's lots of ways you can do it as a club. And that's what we're trying to do out here. Just haven't had the time. But that's one way to get people over that fear factor. And then once they see how easy it is, they end up going out and investing in a vaporizer themselves because that's what it is. It's an investment, not only in the equipment, but in the health of your hives long term, right? I mean, what's $400 if you can keep 5 hives alive in the winter versus you're gonna have to spend $500 to replace them if they all die. So lots of ways to look at it.
Yeah, right. Vapor bar is very expensive and it's not working as well as it used to.
Yep.
Add that up, and $500 for rechargeable vaporization.
Steve, one question about that battery pack thing. What's is the business end of that aluminum or stainless steel?
I think it's stainless. It's not aluminum. It's stainless. I have to look. I have one here, but I'm pretty sure it's stainless.
Could you get to cool it off? As you said, you're concerned about some of the vaporizers that cannot.
Yeah, I think those cups. You could buy extra cups too, so you could swap out cups as you go. I'll have to check with them. I'm pretty sure they're stainless, which means after 1 or 2 applications, you swap out the cups. Dunk the one. Well, you could probably even just dunk it right away and cool it down. And I'll check on that. I'll contact the distributor here in the U.S. because I got one of the first units that came to the U.S. And I did a YouTube video on it, and it's on oxavap.com. It's on their website. You could watch my whole review, but that's I don't get, I had to buy the product. They didn't send it to me free and say, hey, do a good review. I bought it and I did a review and they liked it so much they put it on their website. But I will check on that and give Landy an answer this week and she could share it with you guys. But I'm pretty sure those are stainless.
Great.
I think that's it.
You got any more questions, Lois? No, I think we're good.
I think there are questions in the chat.
He answered them.
Oh, you did?
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah.
Great. We'll cut you loose. Steve, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, everybody. Hope you guys had a good fall harvest and stay tuned. Thank you.
Awesome pizza.
Good.